Hello, and welcome to Varn Vlog Solo. And while increasingly I don't like to talk about parliamentary politics, our congressional politics in the case of the United States, because you can often lose the forest for the trees, I wanted to use the ouster of Kevin McCarthy uh, as a first uh, speaker of the House to be ousted by uh, the opposing party, and that needs to be emphasized actually, in a faction of 8 led by Matt Gaetz within the quote far right of the Republican Party. I put it in quotes because I think it would be fair to say Gaetz is a far rightist, but there's so many different kinds of far rights in the in the GOP that sometimes that actually is not that clarifying of a statement. But it's important to note that it also that the 8 Republicans got most of the Democrats to aid with them to oust McCarthy, which means that the Democrats clearly saw an advantage to throwing the GOP leadership into chaos. There's been a lot of talk from Brianna Joy Gray and Jimmy Dore that this proves the force the vote the first the vote point as a way to get concessions. I'm not sure that it does in the specific, actually. Because in the specific, it seems pretty clear that you'd need most of the other party to be able to pull a similar stunt. And while, yes, there's a lot of GOP who would love to punish Nancy Pelosi, their reasons for doing it would not necessarily be so that the squad could get their agenda any more than the Democrats' reason for doing it is so that Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene can get theirs. In fact, the whole thing seems to be spectacular. But you can still get lost in the forest for the trees here. There's still a principle to be learned. If you're going to engage in electoralism at all, it seems pretty crucial that you have principles, larger orientations, and ethical norms that are not just defensive. If they are just defensive, you're going to surrender and capitulate to people out of fear all the time. And frankly, progressives by and large do that. Their entire motivational strategy tends to be, and this is their entire excuse too, tends to be the other side is so scary, we have to compromise. We'll get concessions from the leadership. Biden's the most progressive president since Ronald Reagan, since in our lifetimes. And to me, that illustrates that progressiveness doesn't mean much because, in some superficial way, yes, it is true. In another way, the people who say that usually are in an income bracket who are fairly comfortable with inflation and stagnation. It is not that the Biden economy is particularly bad, it's who it's bad for and who it isn't. Now, we're yet to see all the programs kick in. One of the problems with Democratic policy making in our klug of a government is that it takes forever for some of these things to be visible, what their effects are, how they're actually going to play out in the economy. And thus, it's actually hard to hold people accountable in one way or another for their immediate effects. And they're designed that way. Even when the ACA, most of the ACA wasn't fully implementable until after, 2012, when it was voted on in 2009. This is something to think about. This is because you're moving these complicated industries in a way that in the past they were easier to move. But let's be real here for a second. This is the principle that Dore and Gray are still ultimately probably closer to right on than a lot of the progressive left, even if we hate Dore's politics ultimately. No, I actually am torn on the figure of Jimmy Dore, and I realize that whenever I bring him up, I get all kinds of responses because a lot of you are too attached to media personalities, and even your like agreements with elements of their fan base than listening to the points made. Here's the reality of the situation. Progressives have to be able to punish moderates. Force the vote is unlikely to work for the reasons that the Democrats supporting Matt Gaetz' ousting of Kevin McCarthy is partly to make the Republicans more chaotic and to engage in the spectacle. It's not so that Matt Gaetz can get his agenda done. And in that sense, a force the vote shutdown like that would probably not be immediately effective. And the gradualism assumes a whole lot. That you wouldn't be punished in primaries, that the more well-funded end of the party won't destroy you. And the Democrats, to be honest, they probably will. But abstentionism, true abstentionism, that actually was Marx and Engels' suggestions to the SPD when they were alive. Don't support bourgeois governments. Get out of the way for things that might help the working class, but do not give an anti-working class government a shred of solace otherwise. That was their electoral strategy. If you read the book by Mac McNair, Revolutionary Strategy, that's also the strategy he more or less supports himself. Do not oppose pro-worker reforms, but don't support the government. Because you'll be left wearing egg on your face if you do. When they betray you, which is almost structurally the most likely outcome. And what happens when that happens? Your entire political movement gets subsumed. Don't believe me? What happened to the left in Britain after Corbyn? Why has the left seemed to be divided amongst itself in the US after Sanders? Because the moment of organic unity wasn't turned into anything meaningful. Now, where I differ from Dore and Bourgeois Gray is that I actually think our institutions need to be even more independent than something like force the vote allows. Are the unions willing to sit on their hands? Not necessarily endorse reactionary candidates, but sit on their hands. Or are they going to be persuaded simply by a president showing up at their ranks? Of course, most union leadership is not that stupid, and most rank and file people are even less so. But it's easy to feel false momentum, and there's a tendency within the progressive and social democratic left, which, let's be honest, are for most people the same thing, to not look at this as what needs to be looked at. Why could you not do anything about the railroad strike? Because you didn't have the capacity to punish. And so even if people were sincere, which I have no reason to believe that they were, in believing that they were going to get backdoor concessions to the railroad workers, if we'd been able to punish them, it'd be a different thing. And I don't mean just like, oh, the DSA is going to vote to kick AOC out. That's not punishing. When you don't have when your endorsement doesn't really matter that much, and in the case of the squad, let's be honest, the DSA is not strong enough for it to really matter, not at this point. And you assumed yourself to that movement, but you didn't have the capacity to hold your electeds accountable, and you don't really want to, because it would be only symbolic at this point. And the people who say that are right. That's because you didn't build up enough institutional capacity before any of this to punish. which means you don't really have an organization riding on top of a political movement. And for all the organic movement that the Bernie Sanders campaign showed in 2016 in particular, and even in 2020, people wetting their institutional capacity and subsuming it into the Democratic Party saved the center. And whether or not I believe with a parliamentary stunt like force to vote would fix this, which clearly I don't, I do think the underlying principle that you would be able to punish electeds to get concessions is the only way that a new force for the left could actually happen, because that would actually gain compromise. And even then, you still would have to stand apart. You still would have to be abstentionist. One of the reasons why the reactionaries have won, yes, they're being defunded, yes, blah, 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 but not all of them are, is they're not just willing to burn down their party in public, and the Democrats are more than willing to let them. They're also willing to unseat and battle in institutions and even destroy them if they need to. And they've been doing this since movement conservatism hit the rocks in the middle of the Bush administration, which would now be almost 20 years ago. The nascent paleo conservatives and bad fitting Brooks Brothers suits, they outflanked the neocons for a while. And while Trump ultimately was too incoherent to really support their vision, they actually had a seat at a table for the first time since the first Reagan administration. And it morphed into other things. It morphed into everything from the alt-right to national conservatism to the Freedom Caucus to whatever. And these are not good things from my point of view at all. And their strategic orientation is different. They're not defensive. They don't need to be. And I admit, for leftists and progressives, that's always going to be a problem. Leftists and progressives are advancing a positive agenda, even if they're advancing it against something like capitalism. Whereas a reactive agenda is trying to create a positive agenda that rolls us back to something that already existed. The strategic aims are different. So you can't go one to one. If we were only like to right, we would win. And you definitely can't tail them. But the principle that they will punish not just individual politicians, not just rhinos, but entire institutions by sitting on their hands, that's why they always seem more of a vital counter-systemic force than a lot of the progressive left and the social democrats who support them do. I don't say this out of nihilism or wanting to burn the whole system down, even though I don't think that system is sustainable. I mean, one of my prepositions is the Constitution itself is a problem, and that as a society, we've been ignoring it by, frankly, barely legally justifiable dependencies on constitutional patches to fix the framework. And maybe that'll work. Maybe that's, the passive revolution way to do it, but you'd have to more actively court that. Instead, it's been kind of liberal duct tapes on the fundamental contradictions that emerge from our Constitution in the United States. And that's not even putting us in the global situation. Lastly, and I say this even for the Ukrainian people, the situation in Ukraine is one where we should be pushing for peace. A just peace with concessions from both sides, but peace. It seems to me the dark undertruth of a whole lot of this is that, um, and the left's response to this is that a lot of the left support of it is purely partisan. That there is a sense in which um, a lot of the more nationalist forces in Ukraine are ugly. A lot of the more nationalist forces in Russia are ugly to look at. But that allowing Ukraine to become the Afghanistan of Central and Eastern Europe, to bleed out Russians, which in a war that, as far as a criterion that involves getting Crimea back, it seems very unlikely without direct NATO intervention Ukraine can possibly win. Would help elements of NATO, but it's not even going to help the average Ukrainian. It's going to sacrifice them on the altar of European geostrategic security. And I realize that there are also fears of further invasion. But it's funny to me how anti-war liberals have all of a sudden began talking like neoconservatives about the next war. Perpetual war for perpetual peace has never been a strategy. And that does seem to be something we're willing to punish people on, instead of being mealy-mouthed about it. Does that mean you should support, Russian advancement? Does that mean you should take a Manichaean view of this war? I don't think so. Nor do I think the question of national sovereignty is easily answered in this case. And I don't just say that because it's hard. National sovereignty is always hard. It's always something the left has been unable to properly deal with. But we need principles around this, not geostrategic projection or hoping something else will emerge. We should be listening to anti-war activists on both sides, in so much as there is any on the Ukrainian side. And an accounting for how this happened that is not simply interested in adjudicating simple blame would be the first step for an independent internationalist left to do. We need domestic principles, but peace. Not under any auspices and not under any grounds. But our primary focus should not be aiding something that pretends like NATO is particularly interested in being a force of progressive change in the world, while also admitting that in geostrategic policy, blindly supporting any state is probably not a good idea. I know that I will get called both pro-Putin and anti-imperialist for this, because this position seems to really bother people. And I think that in working class autonomy domestically are the two things we need. It would be a place to start to have some principles again. This other opportunism has not worked out well. We can't punish the electeds. And frankly, we've been just as opportunistic in our relationship to them as they are with the party. Why should we expect anything else? And while some parliamentary stunt like force the vote is frankly spectacular in the worst sense of that term, the principle of punishing for concessions and building institutions that are willing to do that, are being willing to punish them, that's how you have political efficacy. I'm sorry, blindly following a popular front where you listen to what the center of the party does, the center of a party that isn't yours and doesn't have your interest in mind, because if a few milk toast supporters pushed through by executive, that means that the moment the executive changes, and it will eventually, you could lose all those reforms. That's stupid. And it's time to grow up. Yes, many of you need to kill the Jimmy Dore in your head to think that forced vote will be the magical solution that would finally get people to abandon the Democrats. But also, a lot of you need to kill the popular front in your head a whole lot more. Have a good day.